Hi, everybody. My name is Jessie MacLeod. I'm an associate curator here at Mount Vernon. And today I'm looking forward to sharing with you a presentation on the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and their efforts to build a collection of Washington artifacts here at Mount Vernon. So as most of you probably know, at Mount Vernon, we welcome about 1 million visitors a year. And in fact, there have been more than 96 million people who have visited Mount Vernon since it opened to the public in 1860. But while Washington's home is familiar to nearly everyone, less known is its history as a historic site and the story of the remarkable women who saved it and continue to preserve it today. So today I'm looking forward to giving you a glimpse into that story of Mount Vernon as a museum and the remarkable stories of some of the original Washington objects that have found their way back home to our collection. But first, just a little bit of background. Mount Vernon is located on the Potomac River, about 15 miles south of Washington, D.C., and it was, of course, the home of George Washington for 45 years, from 1754 until his death in 1799. Mount Vernon was Washington's favorite place, even as he left to serve as a colonel in the French and Indian War, as general in the American Revolution, and as president of the new United States. He always longed to return to his beloved estate. And over the course of his residence, he expanded the house several times, culminating in the 2.5-story, 11,000 square foot mansion that you see today, and which is visible in the painting that you see on the screen, which was done in 1791. Washington also expanded his property holdings, operating a plantation of nearly 8,000 acres by the end of his life, and dozens of hired laborers and more than 300 enslaved people staffed Mount Vernon's household workshops and fields. Now, in 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, who was a widow with 2 young children. The couple never had any offspring of their own, but Washington was a devoted stepfather and later a step-grandfather to Martha's descendants from her first marriage. And here in this painting by the same artist who did the painting of Mount Vernon that you just saw, you can see the Washingtons with Martha's 2 youngest grandchildren, Nellie and Washi, who lived with the couple for most of their childhoods. George Washington died of a throat infection in December of 1799, and Martha passed away 2.5 years later. After her death, the household's contents were dispersed. Martha and her husband bequeathed treasured items to friends and relatives, while other Mount Vernon furnishings were sold at public and private sales. So by the time Bushrod Washington, George's nephew who inherited the estate, moved in, his aunt and uncle's possessions had largely been scattered to the winds. In the 19th century, Mount Vernon was owned by a series of collateral Washington descendants who quickly found that the American public saw Mount Vernon as their own. Uninvited tourists showed up on the property to pay respects to Washington's home and tomb, in some cases rather disrespectfully breaking off tree branches and pocketing pebbles as souvenirs. Jane Charlotte Blackburn Washington, the widow of George Washington's grandnephew, who's depicted in the right-hand portrait that you see on the screen, she owned Mount Vernon from 1832 to 1841, and she once commented to a friend, "I never would have submitted to the endless intrusions and sacrifices of everything like a private right and domestic privacy, but that I believe it arises frequently from a sincere, though thoughtless desire of honoring the memory of General Washington." The costs of maintaining Mount Vernon's 18th century buildings also proved challenging, especially as the plantation's income declined during Virginia's mid-19th century economic depression. And in that same letter, Jane Charlotte went on to say, "We have done and shall continue to do all we can to keep the place from entire decay. It is yearly becoming more expensive and difficult to do so. The buildings all ought to be thoroughly repaired, or they must in a few years go down." So this leads us to the story of Mount Vernon's preservation. In the fall of 1853, Louisa Bird Cunningham of South Carolina was traveling via steamboat on the Potomac River and described the view in a letter to her daughter. She wrote, "It was a lovely moonlit night. I went on deck as we passed Mount Vernon. I was painfully distressed at the ruin and desolation of the home of Washington. And the thought passed through my mind, why was it that the women of this country did not try to keep it in repair if the men could not do it? It does seem such a blot on our country. Her daughter, Anne Pamela Cunningham, who was then 37 years old, took up the charge. She sent a letter to a Charleston newspaper under the pseudonym A Southern Matron, calling upon the mothers and daughters of the South to raise general contributions to purchase Mount Vernon, calling it the shrine of true patriotism. Stoking fears of Northern industry, she urged them to prevent its threatened desecration by, as she wrote, manufacturers and manufactories, noise and smoke, and deafening machinery. In her effort, Cunningham faced enormous challenges. There were virtually no models for a private philanthropic organization devoted to historic preservation, which itself was a brand new concept at the time. And on top of that, she was a woman in an era when women lacked the right to vote, and prevailing norms dictated that women confine their efforts to the home, certainly not to public leadership or the management of money and property. Making matters more difficult, Cunningham was an invalid, suffering throughout her life from what she termed a nervous disease, which manifested in back and muscle pain, headaches, dizziness, and difficulty walking. On her first visit to Mount Vernon, the diminutive Cunningham had to be carried from the wharf up the hill to the mansion. And finally, in the 1850s, the United States was facing a simmering political crisis, with the nation torn apart over slavery and its expansion into Western territories. And yet, Cunningham was undeterred. Her instincts, it turned out, were very good. Her newspaper appeal struck a chord and was reprinted in outlets across the country. Sensing that her appeal to Southern women was limiting, she quickly rebranded and named her organization the Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union, extending her efforts nationwide. In doing so, she removed her cause from the political sphere and turned her gender from a liability to a strength. Who better to preserve the home of Washington than women, she argued, whose purity and morality made them the most fitting guardians of this national shrine. While Cunningham forged ahead with her fundraising efforts, it took 5 years for her to convince Mount Vernon's last private owner, John Augustine Washington III, to sell his property to a group of women. Washington had initially hoped to dispose of Mount Vernon only to the government of Virginia or the United States, but when neither proved interested, he finally relented. In February 1858, Cunningham and Washington signed an agreement in which the MVLA would pay $200,000, which is about $7 million in today's money, in installments over the next 5 years. With this agreement in place, Cunningham doubled down on her fundraising efforts and formalized the structure of her organization. She appointed a series of vice regents, each representing their state, who coordinated fundraising efforts within that state. These vice regents then appointed lady managers who solicited donations on the local level, whether within their city or their county. Many of these early vice regents were the wives or daughters of politicians and prominent businessmen, with Cunningham hoping that the political and social connections could prove useful to the organization. They were also smart, talented women who had few other opportunities to participate in public life, and so being a part of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association was a worthwhile outlet for them. To raise money, the MVLA sold lithographs of Gilbert Stuart's famous portrait of Washington for $1 each, and a monthly newsletter, the Mount Vernon Record, printed fundraising appeals, historical articles, and the names of donors to the Mount Vernon Fund. The ladies also had the help of some prominent men who took on their cause. One was politician and orator Edward Everett, whose illustrious career included stints as Secretary of State, Ambassador to the United Kingdom, U.S. Senator and Representative from Massachusetts, and President of Harvard University. Today, Everett is perhaps best known for giving a 2-hour-long speech at the dedication ceremony of Gettysburg National Cemetery in 1863, just before Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous 2-minute Gettysburg Address. Everett traveled throughout the United States delivering his lecture on the character of Washington to audience who eagerly bought tickets to hear the famous orator. Everett delivered his lecture 129 times on behalf of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and he raised more than $69,000, which was roughly a third of the money required to purchase the property. So thanks to all of these fundraising efforts, the association was able to pay the $200,000 asking price in just 2 years instead of 5. And in 1860, they assumed control of the property. Of course, at that point, they were faced with the formidable task of restoring the house and opening it to the public as a museum. This was a new endeavor. In the mid-19th century, there was no model for a historic house museum. While others suggested to Anne Pamela Cunningham that she might turn Mount Vernon into a memorial sculpture park, replace the aging house with a replica, or tear down all the accessory buildings except for Washington's home and tomb, she was clear in her vision of restoring Mount Vernon as Washington knew it. The mansion and the grounds around it should be religiously guarded from changes, she urged her fellow ladies in her 1875 farewell address. Those who go to the home in which he lived and died wish to see in what he lived and died. The association's first priority, then, was to begin much-needed repairs to the buildings, and you can imagine from seeing this 1862 photograph that these were extensive and costly. But almost immediately, they also began to bring original Washington objects home. The association's very first acquisition occurred even before they had taken over the property. In February of 1859, the ladies heard word that the daughter-in-law of Nellie Custis, Martha's youngest granddaughter, wished to donate Nellie's harpsichord, which had been a gift from George Washington in 1793. The ladies accepted, and John Augustine Washington accommodated the donation, allowing them to move the harpsichord to Mount Vernon before they had officially taken ownership. When the Washington family vacated the house in 1860, they left behind an eclectic assortment of original Washington items that formed the basis of the MVLA's collection. These included the key to the Bastille, which was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette to George Washington, a set of leather fire buckets that had George Washington's name on them, a piece of coral that Washington had brought back from Barbados on his only trip outside of the United States, the Udon bust of George Washington, which was said to be the best likeness of him by his family members, Washington's globe, which stood in his study and that he had used during his presidency, and a leather canteen from Washington's military days. So aside from these few relics, the rooms of the house remained largely empty. And you can see in this engraving from the 1850s of the Washington's bedchamber how empty it was. As a solution, Nancy Halstead, the vice regent from New Jersey, proposed that each room of the house be adopted by a particular state, with the state's vice regent soliciting donations of furniture and relics to outfit each space. In an 1869 appeal to her state, Mrs. Halstead declared, "Any article of antiquity in good order, in furniture or for ornament, will be gratefully received at Mount Vernon." In 1870, the council minutes noted that the state of New Jersey, quote, "stimulated by the energy and enthusiasm of its vice regent, had sent furniture, carpets, and antiquities to the value of nearly $2,000. These items were not purported to be owned by Washington, but they rather provided the house with a much-needed home-like appearance. Now, while some rooms aimed to recreate a domestic appearance, others served more as galleries and repositories of relics. In the New York room, sponsored by the Vice Regent for New York, Rembrandt Peale's monumental painting Washington Before Yorktown, which was painted in 1824 and thus never seen by George Washington, dominated the west wall of the room. The canvas was so large that it had to be removed from its stretchers and rolled up in order to fit in the door. Other rooms held relic cases filled with an assortment of curiosities, some with only tenuous connections to Washington. There were the ever-popular locks of Washington's hair and a fragment of his coffin, articles of clothing, a piece of wood from the Old North Bridge of Revolutionary War fame in Concord, Massachusetts, a taxidermied woodpecker shot on the Mount Vernon grounds, and an assortment of other relics. By the late 19th century, however, the ladies began to coalesce around a strategy for furnishing the mansion, based on the inventory that was taken after George Washington's death, which provided a detailed list of items in each room of the house. And now around this time, more original Washington objects started to emerge, which allowed the ladies to expand their collection of Washington material and refine the accuracy of the mansion's furnishings. By the 1890s, several generations removed from George and Martha Washington, their relatives and descendants became more willing to part with their family relics. From a combination of declining emotional connections to the objects and financial resources diminished by the Civil War, members of the Washington and Custis families, like other old families up and down the East Coast, realized that they were willing to part with family treasures, especially if it brought in much needed cash. In 1890 and 1891, there were two major auctions of items that descended through George Washington's nephews. You can see the front page of the catalog for one of those on the screen. While the ladies lacked funds for major acquisitions due to the ongoing expense of repairs to the estate, many viceregents purchased objects on behalf of their estates and then donated them to Mount Vernon. And these included the images that you see, such as a punch bowl, a mantel clock, card table, and numerous books from Washington's library. While many of these objects came from prominent descendants of the Washington and Custis families, other objects came through more unexpected connections. In 1891, the MVLA was contacted by the minister of a Washington, D.C. church, whose parishioner, an 86-year-old Black woman named Lucy Harrison, was in possession of a chair said to be at the bedside of George Washington when he died. Harrison had, her minister explained, contended with several strokes of paralysis and looked to the money from the sale of the chair, quote, for comfort when her strength fails. Phoebe Epperson Hearst, the wife of businessman and U.S. Senator George Hearst and the mother of publishing mogul William Randolph Hearst, was then serving as the vice-regent for California, and she agreed to buy the chair for $100 and donate it to Mount Vernon. Now, research in recent decades has revealed even more details about who Lucy Harrison was and why she might have had this chair. Harrison's mother was Caroline Branham, who was an enslaved housemaid at Mount Vernon, who lit the fire in the bedchamber of the Washington's room every day and was in the room when Washington died. Harrison was born around 1806 at Arlington House, the home of Martha Washington's grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. 19th century sources and family oral history suggest that Custis was likely Lucy's father. Now, Harrison received her freedom in 1846, and in 1870, as you can see in the excerpt from the census on the screen, she was living in Washington, D.C. with her daughter Caroline and working as a washerwoman or a laundress. And through it all, she kept this chair, a daily reminder of her own complex ties to the Washington and Custis families. On the other end of the spectrum, some objects took winding paths back to Mount Vernon via the most powerful men in America. George Washington purchased this leather upholstered armchair in 1790, and he used it throughout his presidency. The chair's seat contains a swivel mechanism, much like a modern office chair, and Washington, who delighted in technology, called it his uncommon chair. When he retired, he brought it back to Mount Vernon, where it stood in his study. Washington left his uncommon chair to Dr. James Craik, who was his personal physician. And sometime before 1833, Craik's descendants gave the chair to Andrew Jackson, the 7th president of the United States. In the 1820s, many Washington admirers had become devotees of Jackson, who shared Washington's legacy as a military hero turned president, although with very different politics. Jackson family members kept the chair at their Nashville plantation, the Hermitage, where you can see it in this photograph on the right-hand side of the screen, where it appears alongside Andrew Jackson's sword. In 1905, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association purchased the chair from Jackson's descendants for $100, with $25 donated by Tennessee school children. The uncommon chair was not the only object to come to Mount Vernon via a U.S. president. This military sash is known as the Braddock sash because it belonged to Washington's commander during the French and Indian War, General Edward Braddock. Braddock purportedly gave Washington the sash after he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Monongahela in 1755. The red silk sash was worn across the chest as a sign of rank for officers, as you can see in this 1772 portrait of George Washington. But it was also practical because it could be used as a stretcher to carry injured officers off the battlefield. We don't know whether it was used this way for Braddock, but it does contain several stains that look suspiciously blood-like. So after George Washington's death, this sash was inherited by Martha's granddaughter, Nellie Parke Custis Lewis, whose daughter and son-in-law presented it in 1846 to Zachary Taylor, who was then a hero of the Mexican-American War and would become U.S. president in 1849. After Taylor's death, the following year, the sash passed to his daughter. Now, fast forward to 1918, and Prince Yoshihisa Tokugawa, who was the son of the last shogun of Japan, visited Mount Vernon. According to MVLA records, he was so impressed with sentiments of admiration and with reverence for the memory of General Washington that he made a personal gift of $1,000 to be used for the purpose of purchasing some relic which it would be appropriate to place in General Washington's home. That money was used to purchase this sash from President Taylor's descendants. Now, while the aforementioned items had a very public afterlife, other Washington objects disappeared from public view for more than a century. In 1948, the MVLA was contacted by descendants of Eliza Parke Custis Law, who was Martha Washington's eldest granddaughter, who had a military trunk of George Washington filled to the brim with family treasures. The trunk contained a blue cloth coat, a linen waistcoat and trousers, and knit garters worn by General Washington, Washington's false teeth, a brown satin gown, white satin slippers, and a sunbonnet worn by Mrs. Washington, and a patchwork quilt cover made by Martha, among many other items. Many of these were accompanied by notes from Eliza detailing their histories. Regarding the blue coat, she remarked, "This coat was made of the first American cloth sent to General Washington and much worn by him. My grandmother gave it to me as a relic. The buttons were begged from me by many who prized them as relics of the father of our country." On a dress bodice of Martha Washington, she noted, "This is the body of a favorite gown of my dear grandmother's. I used the other part in a dress for myself as long as it lasted, then made it into small bags to give the fare of the Sisters of Charity. Thus it is preserved for many more eager to possess a relic of Mrs. Washington." In fact, through separate channels, Mount Vernon has acquired several of the bags that Eliza made from the skirt of this dress, reuniting pieces of the original garment. These were not the only descendants to come calling with a trunk of Washington objects. In 2007, Mary Lee Bowman and her brother Robert E. Lee IV decided to open two trunks that had long been stored in a corner of Mrs. Bowman's basement. Inside, they discovered a trove of Washington silver, including this 4-bottle wine cooler and bottle roller. George Washington had acquired these tablewares from London during his presidency, and the 4-bottle wine cooler could be filled with ice and placed on the table to keep glass decanters of wine cool. Washington quickly realized, however, that when full, these coolers would weigh 8 pounds, and the weight would, he feared, make them, as he said, too unwieldy to pass, especially by ladies. As a solution, he commissioned a custom bottle roller that similarly had space for 4 bottles and had the benefit of casters on the bottom, so it could be rolled across the table instead of passed. After Martha Washington's death, the silver was passed on to her grandson, George Washington Parke Custis, who saved the silver along with numerous other relics at his Arlington House home, 14 miles north of Mount Vernon, which he turned into a museum to Washington's memory. The author Benson Lossing actually visited Custis and sketched these items for his 1859 book on Mount Vernon and George Washington. After Custis died, the silver descended to his daughter, Mary Custis Lee, who had married Robert E. Lee. When the Civil War began, Lee knew that Arlington House could become a target, and he urged his wife and children to evacuate. They packed up the Washington silver into trunks and sent them for safekeeping to the Virginia Military Institute, 180 miles away in Lexington, Virginia. However, in 1864, Union General David Hunter raided the region, and the silver was only saved thanks to the quick thinking of the VMI superintendent, who buried the 2 trunks. When General Hunter set fire to all the public buildings on the VMI campus, the trunks with the family heirlooms were safe beneath the Earth's surface. Thanks to these actions, the Lee descendants were able to rediscover the silver many years later and donate it to Mount Vernon. In recent years, the pace of Mount Vernon's acquisition of original Washington objects has slowed, simply because we have already acquired so many. However, every once in a while, items become available that we can't possibly pass up. In 2012, Christie's auctioned off George Washington's personal copy of the Constitution and Bill of Rights, known as the Acts of Congress. Washington rarely wrote in his books, but this volume contains marginal notes where he is flagging the duties of the president and other noteworthy topics. As you can imagine, Mount Vernon had stiff competition for this acquisition, and it ultimately sold for nearly $10 million. Unlike the early days of the association, when acquisitions were largely funded by the generosity of individual vice-regents, thankfully today we have an acquisitions endowment as well as many donors who are willing to help us with these once-in-a-lifetime purchase opportunities. The last acquisition I'll highlight is one of the most recent, which is a series of objects that descended in the family of another of Martha Washington's grandchildren, Martha Parke Custis Peter. The Peter family collection consists of nearly 100 objects from Mount Vernon, ranging from Martha Washington's diamond-studded watch to an 18th century coffee grinder. Many of these objects had been on loan to Mount Vernon for years, but we were fortunate to have the opportunity to add them to our collection in 2020. It was thanks to years of staff cultivating relationships with the owners of these items that allowed us to finally bring them home to Mount Vernon permanently. Today, Mount Vernon's curatorial and library staff receive several hundred inquiries every year concerning possible Washington and Mount Vernon objects. With a collection of roughly 20,000 objects in limited storage facilities, we're guided in whether we acquire objects by our collecting priorities. So these priorities fall into 3 categories, the first being objects original to Mount Vernon or owned by the Washingtons. The second being period objects that can stand in for ones that were at Mount Vernon in the 18th century when we don't have the original. And the third is commemoratives, memorabilia, objects that relate to the legacies of George and Martha Washington or to the history of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And then there is a 4th category, which is shaped by what we know we don't have. And by that, I mean reproductions of original Washington objects. So when we can't find Washington's original, or if it's not safe to continue displaying it, we have commissioned reproductions of those objects. So for example, currently in the mansion, we have a fully playable replica of Nellie Custis's harpsichord, which allows us to display the original in our museum, which has a much more stable environment for such a delicate object. And as a bonus, because the replica is fully playable, while the original is not, we can hear the sounds of the 18th century in the music that Nellie might have played for the Washingtons and their guests. We also have numerous opportunities in the mansion to bring together all of these items, whether it's original Mount Vernon material, 18th century period objects, reproductions, to display the rooms in the house as George Washington knew them, which has long been the goal of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and we're now able to achieve that goal to the highest of our abilities. So all of the rooms in the mansion are furnished according to George Washington's inventory and the latest research in American decorative arts and material culture. And all of these rooms allow us to provide visitors with what Anne Pamela Cunningham envisioned, which is an accurate look at in what George Washington lived and died. And here I have just a few images of the rooms in their latest iteration, where you can see our efforts to fully furnish the bed chambers, the parlors, the new room, the dining room, with all of the latest research and objects that are available. We also have a new museum installation, which is entitled Mount Vernon, The Story of an American Icon, which opened in April. And this showcases objects that are either too fragile to be on display in the house or that are best seen in a gallery environment where visitors can really get up close and see the details. Here we have that Udon bust of Washington, the original uncommon chair and harpsichord, family portraits, porcelain and silver, and a rotating display of clothing and documents. And in this setting, visitors can really take their time, convene with the collection, and see how these objects can help us better understand George Washington and ourselves. And we hope that you all will come down to the museum if you haven't already and see these objects on display, and to really take an opportunity to see how Mount Vernon has built its collection thanks to the hard work of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and how we can better understand the Washingtons and their lives through these objects. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope you will come and see us soon at Mount Vernon. Take care.